They used to call it the Bible of baseball. And the truth is that the Sporting News really was the greatest baseball publication of all time, especially during its golden age. With excellent articles and fantastic illustrations, the Sporting News was heaven for baseball fans in a way that no other publication or website has been able to match since. And it seemed for decades like the good times would never end. But then, almost without warning, the whole publication completely changed. It's almost like it was overnight. And yeah, I know I got the spiffy getup on today, right? It's a Sunday. I mean, what can I say? Anyway, the Sporting News quickly changed from a classic newspaper featuring some of the best illustrations we've ever seen, some of the most amazing journalism that we've seen, a lot of the analysis that eventually led to things like sabermetrics and so on. It changed from all of that into another Sports Illustrated wannabe. And the history behind all of this is much more interesting than you think, and it's a lot more interesting than the stupid Wikipedia page tells you, trust me. So let's dive right on in. The first issue of the Sporting News came out in the middle of March 1886. While the newspaper's chief focus was baseball, baseball was not the only sport that it covered. For example, the front page of that first issue included an article about Matsuda Sorakichi, a famous Japanese sumo wrestler. Matsuda was the first Japanese sumo wrestler to become hugely popular in the United States, though today, of course, he's mostly unknown. There was also coverage of sports that the publication would eventually ignore, things like car racing in St. Louis. In that sense, the Sporting News actually covered a greater variety of sports than even the local St. Louis newspapers would cover. Now, I bring this up from the start because I want to dispel a myth that has come up over and over again over the years, right? The Sporting News actually started as a general sports publication, not just a baseball publication, right? What happened is that the paper gradually stopped covering other sports. And by something like 1905 or 1906, it ceased covering football altogether. College football was kind of the last straggler. That's right before the paper became really big. And so the truth is that most people had forgotten about the way that things once were. Now, the other thing that people forget about is that the Sporting News had a lot of competition in the early years. The biggest competition in the early days came from The Sporting Life, which started back in 1883 and which was much more established than The Sporting News. The Sporting Life was also a weekly publication, and it was headquartered in Philadelphia, which gave it better proximity to that East Coast sporting market. And for those of us who are interested in using these papers for baseball history research, The Sporting Life is actually readable. So one of the biggest problems that we have when we try to research the old issues of the Sporting News is that all that we have are old microfilm photos of these newspapers that were really poorly captured. I don't know when they were created. My guess is either the 50s or 60s, because once you get up to, it's like sometime in the 40s, then the issues become easier to read. Anyway, I don't know exactly when they did this. I just wish that they had, and I wish that we still had the stacks around, right? I do know, however, that those microfilm photos have extremely low fidelity, and when you look at the scans, it really stands out, because when you try to zoom in to see what the heck does this say, it's just a bunch of dots. You can't read any of it, right? So when you're combining this bad fidelity with the type of newsprint that the Sporting News used back in those days, really the old issues are basically unreadable. In fact, I'll show you. This is the front page of the Sporting News from September 24th, 1908. If I zoom in a bit, you can sort of read what the articles say, though it's a little bit difficult. And sadly, the nature of the old black and white scan means things like Scotch tape make huge sections literally unreadable. While this scan of the September 26, 1908 issue of Sporting Life isn't perfect, at least you can read the articles. It helps, of course, that the Sporting Life was using more modern printing and spacing techniques. In contrast, the Sporting News was still using the old narrow column style that was popular in the 1880s. Now, if you grew up reading the Sporting News and you're watching this, so you grew up in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, even the 80s, right? All of this is going to be very, very confusing to you. The reason why is because that paper that you loved back in those days is nothing like the original newspaper was. And there have been generations of baseball researchers, guys like me who get stars in their eyes, who are really excited, who run over to this stuff and are like, I'm going to find all of the secrets out. We've walked away discouraged because we've realized just how difficult it is to work with the original Sporting News scans, especially from the dead ball era and before. I mean, by September 1908, most newspapers in the United States looked something like this, with layouts designed for visual appeal instead of just a bunch of columns. If you're really interested in researching the 1908 pennant races, your best bet is to dive into archives of local newspapers. That's where all the fun is. Of course, the best sports section in the world that year was the Chicago Tribune, which featured daily cartoons like this one, the sort of which we've never seen anything like ever since. But even the New York newspapers offered really eye-catching layouts and designs, something a lot more attractive than the relatively old-fashioned and conservative sporting news. But I'm going to tell you something. If I were going to go back in a time machine back to 1908 with my spiffy getup here, and if I were going to tell this to the faces of the men who were running the sporting news, they kicked me out of the office, right? You see, the worst possible thing that some punk kid like me could tell these guys is that they should be more like the East Coast establishment. The Sporting News was originally founded by this man, Alfred Henry Spink, and it wasn't necessarily a truly independent publication. Spink and his older brother Billy were born in Canada but grew up in Chicago and became involved with the old St. Louis club in the first season of the National League. It's not entirely clear to me what Spink's relationship was to the original St. Louis Brown Stockings, but it seems that he might have had some sort of ownership interest in the club. Anyway, Spink had worked closely with Chris van der Aa to bring Big League Baseball back to St. Louis. Among other things, the two men collaborated to acquire and improve Sportsman's Park, which of course for years was the oldest baseball stadium in the major leagues. And so, even though the paper offered coverage of the sport as a whole, there was always this pro-St. Louis bias that was looming in the background. Now, the problem that the Sporting News had from the very beginning is that its target audience was not very clear. So, if you're like crazy like me, you're trying content creation and you're like, oh, I'm going to make some stuff and people will watch it, it doesn't work if you're just like, let me make this and if you build it, they will come or whatever. The best way to do this is to be like, oh, I'm going to make content for baseball fans, so let me make baseball content. And then we'll put it together and we'll put it out there for certain types of baseball fans. The problem that the Sporting News had back then is that it was like there was some stuff for fans of the sport. There was some stuff for people who were like magnates, like, you know, the high-end people and stuff like that. There was some stuff that was just sort of like literary in nature. It was about like journalism or whatever. I mean, it's kind of bizarre. So if you spend time trying to, you know, decipher those old illegible articles from way back when, you'll realize that a lot of them are really talking about the business side of baseball and that the actual reporting is kind of lacking. Now, the other thing is, if you're talking about 5 cents a copy back in 1886, that's pretty expensive. It's almost $2 a copy in modern currency. Maybe it's cheaper than magazines these days. I don't know what they cost these days. I pirate everything I read, so whatever, right? But it's still pretty expensive, right? 5 cents in 1886, it's not like people were swimming in money. So part of Spink's problem is that the trend in the 1890s went towards sensationalism and a thing that we used to call the penny press. This trend was most apparent in Joel F. Pulitzer's famous New York World, a 1-cent newspaper that tried to get the widest possible reading audience. By 1900, Pulitzer's paper featured baseball coverage on the front page every day of the regular season, and it used screaming headlines to convince everybody to pay a penny for the copy. If you want to relive the glory days of Christy Mathewson and the 1905 Giants, the best way is through the New York World, not through the Sporting News. And that tabloid style caught on and spread over the years, rendering a lot of the more serious newspapers obsolete. Of course, this was a big problem for Spink and for his Sporting News. The paper was quite conservative for decades. In fact, it was outpaced by the more reader-friendly Sporting Life for years. But there was one major event that changed everything, one thing that propelled the Sporting News into the national imagination and caused it to take over. That event was World War I. Al Spink's nephew, John George Taylor Spink, wound up taking control of the Sporting News in late 1911. Now, this younger Spink, who went by his second middle name Taylor, or usually just J.G. Taylor Spink, wound up becoming the most influential non-player in the history of Major League Baseball. It was J.G. Taylor Spink who finally turned the Sporting News into a reader-friendly direction with gimmicks like sports writer predictions of the coming World Series. And it was under the young Spink that the Sporting News started to extend its reach into baseball culture beyond just newsprint. Now, of course, the best baseball players have always been famous. That's just part of American history. But Spink was pretty foresighted in that he recognized that things like poster-sized photos of ball players really could help him sell newspapers and compete with Sporting Life. And that's also the reason why you can find old Sporting News baseball card sets from like 1916. While this might not be the best looking set of all time, this 1916 Sporting News baseball card set is really famous. This featured the last playing card for legends like Three-Fingered Brown, who went back to the Chicago Cubs in 1916 after 2 years in that doomed Federal League. And of course, it also features one of the most famous rookie cards of all time, and good luck finding a copy of this baby. The back featured an advertisement for the newspaper, and you'll notice that it was still 5 cents a copy in 1916. That's 30 years after the Sporting News was first founded. Now, when the United States started to militarize for its inevitable entry into the Great War, Spink could see that there was potential to bring prominence to his paper. Now, you might consider that opportunism, and it kind of was, but in retrospect, it was opportunistic, but in a very, very brilliant way. And this is really the thing that pushed the Sporting News up and over the top. As early as fall 1917, you started to see these notes on the tops of these newspapers asking readers to donate their copies to soldiers and sailors. In fact, in August 1917, the Sporting News proudly announced that it would provide thousands of free copies of its publication to United States and Canadian troops stationed in training camps and abroad. And when the war finally ended, the Sporting News worked together with the American League president, Ban Johnson, to donate a whopping 150,000 copies of the paper every week to soldiers who were slowly being taken back home. That created a massive, massive fan base for this paper that completely overwhelmed the Sporting Life. This gave the Sporting News a monopoly over that weekly baseball covers, and that's a monopoly that lasted for decades. Thousands upon thousands of people who otherwise might not have paid any attention to professional sports now treated baseball like it was some sort of national duty, right? A lot of this came from the war. A lot of this came from the things that the men would talk about. But most importantly, the only reading stuff you had in addition to the, garbage that the government was giving you was the Sporting News. And of course, that monopoly that the Sporting News happened to create came about at the same time as the rise of Babe Ruth and the modern era of baseball. So say what you want to say about the 1950s, but the 1920s was actually the true golden age of baseball. The Sporting News wound up relaxing its stiff approach considerably and started to include fun things like doggerel poetry and other interesting tidbits here and there. And of course, there was one player that stood out among the rest. Now, traditional baseball history will tell you that Babe Ruth turned the sport around in the wake of the Black Sox scandal. It's not true. Actually, the Black Sox scandal, despite the fact that it happened in 1919, didn't really break in the press until September 1920. Yes, I'm fully aware that, Hugh Fullerton had these articles in some random gambling magazine in late 1919 that was hinting at this. Nobody read this. This didn't really become a story until September 1920. And it had a huge impact on the pennant race that year because the White Sox were in the pennant race and lost their best players right before the final series of the season because they were all crooked. Now, of course, by this time, Babe Ruth had already obliterated the home run record. And so, you can't say that Ruth was, doing something to counteract this. Ruth was done with his season, right? But it was really that conservative and that anti-gambling stance that J.G. Taylor Spink had. That's what proved to be most influential during that time. Though this photo and caption has become famous over time, the Sporting News was actually late to the story. It wasn't really until it was obvious that the Black Sox had taken money that Spink chose sides and came down hard against them. And Spink's editorial position was in favor of a strong leader to clean things up. That led the way to the infamous Kennesaw Mountain Landis. So Kennesaw Mountain Landis, of course, baseball's first commissioner, was known as the Czar of baseball. That should give you an idea of what his power was like. He ruled the sport with an iron fist for decades, right? In fact, in the 1920s, if you were even suspected of talking with a gambler, he would bar you from life, like there was nothing to it, right? Now, J.G. Taylor Spink supported Landis's ascent to the throne from the very beginning. And Spink's influence played a major role in some of the more controversial policies that Landis put forward. Among those, and most famous, was the continuation of that ridiculous policy of racial segregation. The most famous example of Spink's racism comes from this August 6, 1942 editorial, where he rails against the thought of integration. Spink's argument was a continuation of the bizarre but common racial trope that segregation was somehow good for black business. The problem, of course, is that Spink was extremely influential by the early 1940s and was well respected by everybody in the highest levels of baseball authority. And as if it weren't obvious enough already, Spink published the first biography of Judge Landis after the commissioner's death, which demonstrated just how close the two men were throughout the years of Landis's power. In other words, those racist policies were not just the work of Landis alone. He literally had the entire baseball press on his side. And I really, really mean that. I can't emphasize this enough. By the early 1940s, the Sporting News was really the most important sports publication in the entire world, right? It was the most impressive, it was the best, it was clearly the best in the United States, and there was nothing other that could compete with it. And that kind of notoriety really gives you power. This includes power over what we would consider to be like newsworthy and what we would consider to be irrelevant. Let's look at this random issue from late June 1935 for an example. So naturally, the Sporting News printed box scores and game summaries for all major league games, as well as the more important and prominent minor leagues. This included some relatively obscure minor leagues, such as the old Class B Piedmont League in the Old South. There was also the old Class A New York Penn League, right alongside this somewhat alluring cigarette ad. Meanwhile, if you wanted to know about how somebody like Satchel Paige was doing, you would have to read the local daily newspapers, such as the Wichita Eagle over in Kansas. The Sporting News was silent about all the black baseball stars and condemned that side of the sport to obscurity. And even when it came to like the early days of baseball integration, Spink's racism was readily apparent. It's not the sort of thing that we like to talk about, right? I mean, it feels really uncomfortable to talk about this stuff, but this is really something you have to say when you're looking at the history of the Sporting News. I mean, Spink came out directly against the Indians signing Satchel Paige in July 1948, which was about as blatantly racist as he could possibly be. Spink then tried to defend himself, noting that the Sporting News had named Jackie Robinson the Rookie of the Year in 1947, which was an obvious choice. The funny part is that the exact same page features this article by Bill Corum claiming that major league teams were biased against Leo DeRocher, of all things. I mean, how short-sighted can you get? Anyway, regardless of how old he actually was, Paige was a sensation for Cleveland in 1948, going 6-1 with a 2.48 ERA in 21 games, and of course helping Cleveland win the World Series. And there are other examples of this. Honestly, I've been kind of overwhelmed trying to just find this stuff for you. There's tons and tons of it, and a lot of it is kind of subtle. So white players were commonly labeled as the stars. The black players were sort of like the comic relief or a sort of sideshow or something like that. It really is sickening when you find this and when you start thinking about it. Anyway, for all of that horrible racism that was lurking behind the scenes, the truth is that the Sporting News otherwise was actually a great positive force for the game as a whole, especially during those days of the 40s and the 50s. In particular, the newspaper was solely responsible for keeping the historical tradition of the sport alive. By the 1940s, the old tradition of excellent baseball cartoons in daily newspapers was pretty much dead, and nobody remembered gems like this one from Chicago in early October 1908. The old and long-forgotten cartoon tradition stayed alive only in the pages of the Sporting News, and these cartoons were a main feature for decades. In fact, for years, those cartoons were so important that they were the main feature on the front page. That's right, cartoons, not photographs. And if you ask me, the best of those cartoons could do things that photographs never could do. Now, we have lost this in our baseball coverage these days, and it's a shame, especially since even older people don't realize what it is that we once had. The only way that you can truly appreciate what once was and how far we've fallen from that standard is if you take time to look through these old issues and really take a look at the impressive artwork. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say that every single page in these editions from the mid-1950s had excellent drawings and fascinating charts and graphs. The visual appeal of something as simple as the old defensive shift is still compelling even all these decades later. And of course, it was also around this time that the sporting news helpfully started including game summaries with the box scores, adding in a lot of flavor and context to keep the fans interested. Sure, the newspaper built up its reputation and its reader base on the back of those World War I era free issues that led to subscriptions. And yeah, you guessed right, Spink pulled the exact same trick during World War II. That increased his subscriber count exponentially because he got these publications to the servicemen for free for almost the extent of the whole war, and did so basically on the government's dime. But the reason why these papers are still so compelling all these years later is because they offer so much that we just do not see in modern baseball coverage. For example, the sporting news ran contests like this one for years where you could act as if you were the manager. So what would you do in this situation? Would you keep Alvin Dark in the game to bat, or would you go to the bench for a pinch hitter, or do like a bunt or hit and run or whatever? Well, you've got 20 words or less to potentially win $500. Not too bad for 1949. But as much fun as contests like those were, the most impressive thing was this group of ballpark drawings. Honestly, I've never seen anything like this that's quite as cool as this ever since. Okay, way back in 1937, a Chicago sports writer named Ed Burns wrote articles about every ballpark and included these somewhat messy sketches. Some drawings were better than others. For example, the old fence at the Baker Bowl really stands out in this one. Anyway, this approach laid the foundation for one of the most impressive series I've ever seen. Starting in the summer of 1946, cartoonist Gene Mack of the Boston Globe started drawing these detailed sketches of ballparks around the major leagues. These drawings are absolutely incredible. You could spend hours studying them in their rich detail and accuracy. And of course, they were also accompanied by long and detailed explanations. Yeah, Gene Mack was a real treasure, and his stuff for the Boston Globe, if you look back into the 30s, the 20s, and so on, is just absolutely brilliant. We've never seen anybody quite like him since. And as you can see in these drawings, he did this amazing job of combining the mythical side of baseball with this childlike joy for the game itself. Unlike a lot of the forgotten sporting news special features, those Mack drawings were collected in a book in the early 1980s called Take Me Out to the Ballpark. New artists included sketches of the newer stadiums, though they didn't quite have the simplicity and artistic flow of the old ones. In my humble opinion, of course, nothing has ever come close to the originals, although I will admit that some of these Willard Mullins sketches kind of came close. So like I said, we've got nothing like that at all today, right? This stuff is a lot better than looking at all the stupid photos that we get because those all look the same. It's a shame, right? Like, the high-resolution photos are nice, but they don't capture the imagination of the sport quite the way that the old cartoons and sketches used to, right? Same thing with baseball cards, right? These days it's all digital stuff and pictures. Well, what happened to doing the paintings and doing the drawings and stuff like that? Why can't we have that again? I would be more than happy as well to trade all of our modern sabermetric analysts and, like expected, OBA or whatever. I'd be more than happy to trade all you guys over for some of that old school journalism. But I don't know, it could be that I'm just an old guy when it comes to stuff like this. Of course, the sporting news was also known for other publications such as the old baseball guides. These guides were naturally a bit more relevant back in the days when statistical data was harder to come by. Of course, in the old days, there were originally two guides, the Reach Guide and the Spalding Guide. Though both guides used the same sources for statistics, the Spalding Guide was much more conservative and pro-National League, while the Reach Guide was pro-American League. The ravages of the Great Depression caused the two guides to eventually be merged by the late 1930s, and my apologies here for the poor quality of this cover scan. Anyway, starting in the early 1940s, the sporting news took over the baseball guide printing business and held onto it until the digital era finally made the guides completely obsolete. So in other words, during the golden age, the sporting news was basically the one-stop shop for anything and everything related to baseball. Sort of like today, if you're going to go on a message board, chances are you're going to wind up on Reddit because that's where everyone is, right? Like, the sporting news was like the Reddit, but just for baseball, right? So like, if you were going to I don't know, you wanted to become an umpire, you have to go look through the pages to find the umpire school ad, right? If you want to learn about APA and go buy a copy of the game in the 50s, you look in the sporting news, you'd find the advertisement, right? If you were interested in collecting baseball cards in the 1960s, and you're like, well, where do I find a company, that sells, used cards that nobody else wants? Sporting News. It was the place for everything, and the Sporting News as a company also printed everything. The Sporting News printed books about every conceivable topic relating to the history of the sport, such as the greatest 50 individual games. There was also the 25 greatest pennant races of all time. And of course, there were collections of the greatest stories in the history of the World Series, which is baseball's main event. The newspaper itself constantly featured historical articles, including some that dug back further than most baseball historians would go today. Seriously, when they called the Sporting News the Bible of baseball, they weren't kidding. And of course, it looked like the good days would never end. Well, it looked like that for a while until we started to get to the late 50s and the early 1960s. That's when the sporting landscape started to change a little bit, and sort of like the sport of baseball itself, the Sporting News was kind of behind the times, and the times in the end kind of caught up with it. At first, the Sporting News was out ahead of the change. For example, it reintroduced coverage of football and other sports in 1946 after an absence of about 40 years. By 1957, other sports slowly started to show up on the front page, but only in the dead of winter, of course. But while the all sports news showed that the Spink family had an idea of what was going to come, it was not enough to protect the brand. There was a new player on the scene, and it was poised to do everything that the Sporting News couldn't do. Now, Sports Illustrated, to be honest with you, that's really the publication that changed the game. You know, the old Sporting Life newspaper had folded sometime in the 1920s. I'm not exactly sure when. It was sometime around the early Ruth years. Baseball Magazine, which was kind of like a precursor to Sports Illustrated, was long gone. Even when that was around, it was a monthly, not a weekly magazine. Sports Illustrated was weekly. It offered high-class photography that was really impressive with great colors, especially in the earliest issues. It was sort of like an old issue of Time magazine, except it focused solely on sports. And of course, I say that because it was owned by Time magazine. Those are the people who came out with this idea. That means, of course, that there was a lot of money behind the publication. While it took a while for the magazine to catch on, you've got to admit that covers like this one really stand out. And Sports Illustrated made sure to focus on all sports, not just baseball. But the real low blow was the swimsuit edition, which made Sports Illustrated famous. The Sporting News had the box scores, sure, but it didn't have anything that could compete with this. And as the years went on, Sports Illustrated became more and more aggressive. And this is where the controversy really comes into play. No, the Sporting News did not come out with its own swimsuit issue, as much as we would love to see, like Pete Rose or whatever wearing a Speedo. Right. However, the force from Sports Illustrated, this overwhelming power that was coming from that side of things, that really compelled the Sporting News to start changing its policies. And the death of J.G. Taylor Spink also had a lot to do with what wound up happening. When Spink passed away in 1962, the Sporting News was at its height. The eulogy called him Mr. Baseball. That's an impressive title for somebody who never played the game. As pretty as this prose was, however, the truth is that the Sporting News needed to do something to maintain its significance in the ever-expanding sports scene. And so, starting in the early 1960s, the publication began to put photographs on the front cover. Sadly, the days of the compelling cartoon were numbered. The writing was on the wall. In its place, we got a cover design that was clearly intended to compete directly with Sports Illustrated. Now, the change was somewhat gradual, but it came. And it only took a couple of years before the entire focus of the publication had shifted to something else. In only a few years, the old two-tone covers gave way to these fantastic-looking full-color photographs. And of course, it didn't take long before the other sports started crowding baseball off the cover. While there's nothing wrong with celebrating other sports, the truth is that this was a lot different than what people were used to. And as the years went on, the primacy of baseball in the Sporting News slowly started to diminish to the point where by the end, this was just like any other sports newspaper. The box scores remained for a couple decades, of course, but the in-depth coverage of other sports started to take control, such as in this issue from late August 1982, right in the thick of the baseball pennant races. By the mid-1980s, the box scores seemed to be just an annoying feature relegated to somewhere in the back. And by the early 1990s, they disappeared completely. This led to the growth of numerous other newspapers, most famously USA Today's Baseball Weekly, which did the job that the Sporting News no longer wanted to do. Now, as cool as Baseball Weekly was, and as the modern Sports Weekly is, they're not quite the same as what the Sporting News was like back in the golden years. And, the thing is, that's what happens. That's how the world works. That's how the United States works, right? You see, the Sporting News was sold off by the Spink family in the late 1970s. It sort of became this kind of hot potato that was passed around from one mega corporation to another, which is not a good thing. The heart really died out of the publication, and the quality started to dip. And when the quality dips, that's when your readership falls off, and that downward spiral can be very difficult, if not impossible, to stop. I mean, by the mid-1990s, the covers looked better than ever, sure. The content itself, however, was barely a step above what you would find in your daily newspaper. Football coverage bled into the summer, and the minor league coverage, which was once a highlight of the paper, was forced into a single small page. By 2009, the newspaper had transformed itself into a glossy magazine, but by now it was just Sports Illustrated Light. The old artistic drawings were long forgotten, making way for yet another series of uninspired and bland ballpark photographs. And it felt like nobody even remembered what had once made this publication great. Now, the truth is that nobody was reading the Sporting News in the 2000s. So if you're younger than me, you don't remember that time, I can assure you nobody was reading it. In the 2000s, I was like a huge baseball fan. I would spend money, I would buy stuff. I would never touch the Sporting News because it didn't have any substance to it. There was nothing there, right? I don't even remember being curious about it on the newsstands. I would rather buy like Beckett instead of the Sporting News, right? The magazine went from a weekly one to one that barely came out once a month, and the corporate shenanigans continued. So for example, the New York Times reported in early 2011 that the Sporting News was taking over the AOL fan house content. This was a big surprise for those of us who didn't realize that AOL was still in business. The positive energy was commendable, sure, but it was not realistic. Everybody was just going to ESPN by this time. And, surprise, surprise, the Sporting News printed its last physical issue in late 2012 after 126 years of being in print. So you know as well as I do that this is the way that like pretty much all of legacy media is going to wind up in the end. But I can't help but feel that the Sporting News would have done a lot better if it had a different strategy. The problem is that the Sporting News wanted to do whatever it was that Sports Illustrated was doing. This problem became even worse when the Tribune Company bought it from the Spink family in the late 70s and decided that they needed to make like as much money as they could off of the newspaper itself instead of relying on the guides and the other books and all the other stuff that had been working for so many years. And because of this, the Sporting News ended up sacrificing everything that made it special in favor of all of this stuff that made it really bland. I mean, yeah, I get it. I'm a guy. I know why this sort of thing is appealing. But in my opinion, sex appeal is nowhere near as cool as these fantastic front page drawings that used to be the specialty of the Sporting News. And I've seriously got to wonder whether a modern publication might succeed if it had visual appeal like this. While there were no supermodels in swimsuits, there still was this raw energy that felt almost counterculture at times. And sadly, even covers like this just don't do the trick. Well, unfortunately, she's gone, right? It's gone. I don't think we'll ever see anything like it again. But hey, at least we have the archives. And there is a ton of stuff to go over in these archives. I mean, I've only given you like a little, like 0.1% of a percent of what's in it, right? I mean, there's no way I could fit this all into one video. I've got more than enough content from the old Sporting News alone to like have this channel run for years and years and years without repeating anything. Anyway, if you're not familiar with it, go check out the old Sporting News archives. As of the filming of this, they're available for free. I don't think they'll be available for free forever. My feeling is that they'll probably put up a paywall because there's tons and tons of content there. It's tons of fun to go back and read it. And hey, who knows? Maybe you will end up like me and you'll end up regretting the loss of what we once had as much as I do.